So we are quickly approaching here the magical hour of 8:05. So I'd like to get the program started because we do have a full agenda with us today. We are recording this, so if you would like to preview this later on or share it with somebody else, it will be ready for review on early next week. John and I will be monitoring the chat area, so please post your questions there. John and I will curate that chat area, and when we get to the Q&A, then we'll put out those questions. How this came to be is over the last couple of months, TMACC has been working with PennDOT on a project called the Outfitter, which is providing bus service between the city of Coatesville and Gap for urban outfitters. And so several other corporations has come to TMACC and kind of looking at some alternatives. And we started looking at how can we move our early morning workforce around Chester County so that we can fill some of these employment opportunities that we have. From the Coatesville marketplace, roughly in a 20-mile radius, there are around 500 jobs that are available. And one of the stumbling blocks is getting people to those jobs and finding that transit for them. And so, we began to explore more and more about the micro transit. Also at the same time, the Kennett area received a TCDI grant to do a microtransit study. And so what would that mean for the Kennett area and serving that marketplace? And so as we continue to ask the questions, this program then came together for that. Today we have 4 great speakers with us. Olivia Blahut is with us. She is with VIA. She is the East Coast Partnership Lead. Her role at VIA in that position is to help cities and transit agencies define their goals and priorities for improving mobility. Then we have David Perimutter. David is also with VIA. He's the transit planning principal. David specializes in crafting transit plans that offer riders superior service adapted to the age of on-demand mobility. And David is the lead for the microtransit study that is occurring in the Kennett area. Then Derek Sherman is with us. Derek is with CATA, and he's the Assistant ADA and On-Demand Operations Manager. And Derek is actually bringing this to life, and he is going to bring their Bellefonte example showcase for us to see how that is working, some of the pros and cons and trials and tribulations that have gone along with that. And then rounding out our conversation, Brian Donovan with the Chester County Planning Commission, and he's the transportation planner there. Has been doing some work on the fixed bus routes and is going to kind of talk about the Route 3 or the Westchester Pike corridor areas as highlighted one of his projects in that. So microtransit and fixed route go hand in hand very nicely. As we go through this program, Olivia is going to speak first. Once Olivia, you're finished, then hand the baton off to David. David, when you're done, we'll hand off the baton to Derek and so forth. And then at the end, I will curate the Q&A questions. And with that, Olivia, the floor is all yours.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And thanks for having us. We're really excited to talk with this group about microtransit and share a couple of the ways that it's been used, both to sort of complement fixed route, better connect workforce to employers, and overall sort of drive toward growth and equity of access within different communities. Okay, so I think for today, what we'll plan on sharing is first, we'll just start with the basics. What is microtransit? What is it not? When can it be used? And we'll share a couple of examples of sort of how this technology can be made configurable and sort of accessible for all folks in the community. We'll do a quick touch on what is VIA and why are we talking to you about microtransit. We'll share some experiences from the field, highlighting specifically lots of different ways that different communities of all shapes and sizes have adapted microtransit to their particular needs. And then we'll focus specifically on the Kennett Square study that's occurring, and we'll wrap up by answering any outstanding questions. So with that said, let's dive in. So what is microtransit? Let's start with the broad definition. Microtransit is a form of public transit that is providing on-demand shared rides to riders. When you think about a traditional fixed route bus that is circulating on a fixed schedule, on a fixed route, sort of regardless of the demand at any point in time, that's sort of one way of thinking about transit. Microtransit is more dynamic in that trips are dispatched to riders based on real-time demand or sort of demand in the future, but real-time demand where riders are requesting a trip and a vehicle is dispatched to them sort of on an as-needed basis. Riders are also aggregated with other riders into a shared vehicle, making this truly a form of transit, not, for example, sort of just a subsidized taxi ride. It's a way to sort of efficiently serve trips in places where fixed route, there may not be the density or the need or the demand for ridership. So microtransit can actually be quite an effective way to fill in the gaps in a network. So let's think about what if we go back, David, just one more slide, thanks. So for the customer, the rider, what does a microtransit service look like? And there's basically 3 steps to using a microtransit service. So if you're a microtransit rider, you usually use a mobile app or make a phone call to request your trip. You input your origin, your destination, you indicate when you want to travel. You can indicate that you want to travel right now or for a time in the future. Then typically a microtransit software will analyze where all of the vehicles are in a network, where all of the riders and ride requests are coming from, and they will match a rider to a vehicle that's going in the same direction as them, and that can accommodate their mobility needs. So for example, a rider who uses a wheelchair would be assigned a wheelchair accessible vehicle. Once that matching is done, a rider and a vehicle are both instructed to meet each other at what we call a virtual bus stop, which is usually about a 1 to 3 minute walk away from the rider's requested pickup. By asking riders to walk a little bit to their pickup destination, it keeps vehicles moving in a straight line and helps to aggregate riders together. Once on board, paying the fare is usually similar to a bus fee. Riders can pay with a debit card or credit card right in the app, or even with just a bus pass or a voucher like you would on a traditional bus. So then once riders are matched with their vehicle, they get in the vehicle, then they're brought to their destination. Along the way, hopefully they are picking up other riders who are traveling in the same direction, sort of efficiently moving people around. If we go to the next slide. So we'll talk about why some communities are looking to incorporate microtransit or on-demand transit. I'll use the terms interchangeably, why they're looking to incorporate this into their networks. So I think what we hear our partners talk about as far as the challenges of a 100% fixed route model, often our partners talk about challenges with limited coverage from perhaps legacy fixed route systems. Perhaps the frequency is lower than they would like, maybe due to budgetary restrictions. The cost can be quite high, particularly when you think about capital expenses. And finally, our partners talk about sort of the rigidity for fixed route buses. It often feels kind of onerous and time consuming to redesign a bus route or change the hours or otherwise adapt to changes in rider behavior. I think we all saw that when COVID-19 hit. There was very unexpected changes, and our partners wanted to be able to adapt quickly to what they were seeing. When we look at an on-demand model, and when I say an on-demand model, I really mean usually a network that incorporates both fixed route and on-demand together. The on-demand portion can be really useful for a couple of reasons. One, it can serve as a really strong complement for fixed route transit, specifically by providing first last mile trips that feed more ridership into fixed route. On-demand is highly tech enabled and convenient, attracting sort of younger, more choice riders with perhaps different expectations of public transit. I'll also note that it's highly accessible to ensure that sort of existing transit riders can continue to use the services. Microtransit, when deployed in the right places, can be highly cost effective, helping agencies to uncover sort of efficiencies compared to perhaps other modes. And finally, it's highly flexible. You can change the zone or hours or the rules for pickups in microtransit in a day or two. So it allows agencies to be highly, highly flexible as rider behavior changes. If we go to the next slide. What we see is that all of the sort of methods of convenience and accessibility that I mentioned on the last slide, all of those ultimately translate into higher ridership for an agency and, of course, sort of greater mobility for riders. If you look on the right-hand side of this slide, we've just picked out a couple of examples of cities that have converted from either legacy dial-a-ride services or fixed route services and have sort of included microtransit in their networks. Of course, you see pretty impressive ridership growth upon doing that transition. What we've found is that sort of bringing transit to the rider and creating more visibility and trackability really sort of improves riders' ability and interest in riding public transit. If we go to the next slide. The last thing I'll sort of mention about microtransit, because candidly, like this is a question that we get a lot as we talk to agencies. You know, I think there's rightfully a big concern with making sure that, hey, if microtransit is part of public transit networks, how can it be just as accessible as other forms of transit? And so when we think about how to launch a good microtransit service, you know, VIA's perspective is that these services must be held to sort of the most rigorous standards of accessibility and equity. So I'd be happy to get into more detail later, but a couple of the biggest things that we see as important in these systems is one, ensuring that microtransit services offer accessible vehicles. So making sure that there are sort of an appropriate number of wheelchair accessible vehicles to accommodate riders with mobility concerns. We would recommend ensuring that there are actually door-to-door pickups and drop-offs available for mobility limited riders. I talked before about people walking to a virtual bus stop. We'd want to make sure that riders who are seniors or have a disability, that they're not asked to walk. Third, we would always recommend incorporating a phone booking option for those without a smartphone or who don't feel comfortable using an app. We can also offer things like web booking or like a third-party booking system for maybe a senior center or human services agency. And lastly, these services should always provide some sort of option for riders who don't have a bank account or don't have a credit card. We think it's critical that they're able to use, you know, cash, prepaid voucher, physical bus ticket to get equal access to these services. If we go to the next slide. Quickly, before I get into anything else, what is VIA? Why are we here talking to you? VIA is sort of we're a public transit technology company. It's our vision to be the digital infrastructure connecting everything that moves across a community. And we are working with transit agencies throughout the world to help them plan and then operate and optimize really dynamic tech-enabled transportation networks. If we go to the next slide. Quick note on our footprint. Today, we're working with over 500 different cities and transit agencies throughout the world. I think what you'll note on this slide, and that's sort of interesting beyond even like what VIA is doing. What you'll note is that there's cities on here that are metropolitan and dense, like New York and Tokyo and London, but there are also areas that are more rural or suburban. Think Columbus, Ohio, Baldwin County, Alabama, working with Rabbit Transit in Pennsylvania. So there's really quite a bit of variety as far as what types of communities can use microtransit and how they do so. And we'll get into some of that detail as we go forward. Next slide. The next thing I'll just note about sort of how we actually work with our partners. There are two basic ways that we could partner with a city or transit agency or county who wanted to explore microtransit. The first is what we call software as a service or SaaS. In this model, an agency uses its own drivers, vehicles, dispatchers, general operations, and they use our software to operate their own microtransit service. So we'd provide a full technology suite that would allow an agency to operate a microtransit service on their own. We would serve as thought partners and advisors to the service, but ultimately it's the agency sort of on a day-to-day basis. On the other case, VIA can do TaaS or transportation as a service. In this case, you hand over the proverbial keys to us. We procure the vehicles, recruit the drivers, do fuel, insurance, maintenance, everything from A to Z to sort of keep this service running. And it really just depends on sort of what the agency is looking for. If we go to the next slide. We thought we would spend a little bit of time on a somewhat local account here before we get into some more national examples of how microtransit can be used. So if we travel over to York, Pennsylvania, we wanted to highlight a project that Rabbit Transit has been working on in the microtransit arena. So the problem that Rabbit Transit was facing was that they had identified several gaps in their fixed route network where there was demand for transit, but perhaps not enough demand to justify operating a full fixed route. And there was also sort of a lack of coverage both within and between sort of the major commercial areas within their service zone. So what they did is they launched a microtransit service. This is a software as a service model. So Rabbit provides the vehicles, drivers, dispatch, Via provides the software. And what you see they've done is they've identified 2 separate microtransit zones in the area. Riders can get door-to-door service within each service zone, and they can also transfer between zones on this little island in between them. The result is a much more connected and sort of mobile population within these areas. Riders can book through the app, through a phone call, through a web browser, and they can even flag down the bus. So it really does sort of provide a robust set of ways for riders to interact with the service. I think what we've seen is that the service has been very successful for Rabbit Transit. They're doing over 300 rides a week. Riders get picked up in an average of about 9 minutes. And overall, it's been sort of a pretty excellent way for them to expand ridership and coverage in the area. Happy to answer more questions on that later. But if we go to the next slide, thought we'd share a couple more examples before I wrap up. I mentioned earlier that Via's belief is that microtransit can be a very powerful to sort of complement and extend fixed route transit services. These 3 partners are doing so in what we feel are really unique and interesting ways. So if we travel for a moment to Ohio, we've been working with CODA in Columbus for several years. They had launched a microtransit pilot prior to COVID-19. The goal of that service was to sort of increase coverage and specifically to help riders access employment areas in the community. When COVID-19 hit, they suspended some of their routes due to low ridership, leaving coverage gaps for riders who still had to get to work. So they started a microtransit sort of service expansion. In their service, all rides have to start or end at existing bus stops, sort of ensuring that the service is used to complement fixed route bus rides. What they saw was, once they launched that service, they saw a 4x increase in ridership during the first year, really speaking to kind of the success of the service. The next example I'll provide is a city partner of ours, Sault Ste. Marie, Canada. They actually converted some of their fixed route bus routes into microtransit. Specifically, Sault Ste. Marie operates about a 9-bus fixed route network all throughout the week. They identified that on Sunday evenings, there was very low ridership. It didn't quite justify operating fixed route during that time. So they procured our software and they installed it onto their full 40-foot long buses. And how the service now works is throughout the week, they operate traditional fixed route. And then on Sunday afternoon, a flip switches and the whole network becomes on demand. In that case, it's a pretty special case where making that switch allowed them to improve the quality of service for riders. Headways were previously about 60 minutes. Now riders wait about 13 minutes to get picked up. Coverage expanded compared to fixed route. And the agency was able to remove a full bus from service on Sunday evenings, which of course results in operational savings. The final example that I'll talk about is Miami-Dade County down in Florida. They have a robust metro rail system and robust bus network down in Miami. But in certain neighborhoods, particularly lower income neighborhoods in Miami, it was relatively difficult for riders to access the Metro Rail or fixed route bus without a private vehicle. So what we've done with Miami-Dade is we actually identified 4 separate zones throughout the county, each of which surrounds a Metro Rail stop. Today, riders can use the app or make a phone call, book an on-demand trip anywhere they want in the zone, although it's sort of encouraged to go to a fixed route bus stop. Or riders can just travel anywhere they want in the zone. Usually riders wait about 6 or 7 minutes to get picked up, very quick arrival. And I think the most exciting part of this service is that we're doing really interesting work to really integrate the microtransit service with the fixed route. So one great example of this is that when riders are planning their trip in the app, they input their origin, their destination, and we're able to provide to them both microtransit options and fixed route options to depending on sort of which is the most optimal way to get there. So it's really a way for them to grow the visibility and grow ridership on fixed route by sort of also showing those options within the microtransit app. Going forward, we'll also be working with the county to continue to add in more microtransit zones as they embark on what they're calling their Better Bus Network redesign. They're going to continue to think about which routes can be converted to microtransit, maybe due to low ridership and sort of the opportunity to save some money. So hopefully that's a helpful overview. David, I think that's my last slide before we get to consulting. Happy to answer questions now or later, but hopefully that was a helpful overview, not only of microtransit, but also of sort of the vast array of ways in which different agencies can use this mode. And with that, I think I'll hand it over to David.
Thanks so much, Olivia. So before we discuss the Kennett Square microtransit study, just wanted to give a bit more background on what we're doing with VIA. So VIA Strategies is a relatively new division of our company. It's our in-house consulting practice where I work out of. And so I'm a transportation planner by background. I came to VIA about 2 years ago from a transportation consultancy called Nelson Nygaard, doing public transit and shared mobility studies all over the US and Canada. And the reason that VIA really jumped out at me as a really great place to work and an interesting opportunity in the transit industry is I think what distinguishes us as a company is a very constructive approach to working with public agencies and other partners. And part of that, in working with partners over the last several years, we realized that there is oftentimes a pretty significant gap between some of the high level conceptual ideas about how microtransit works that Olivia just discussed. And getting from that conceptual phase to the actual implementation and launch of a service can often be difficult for agencies, whether they're short-staffed or they're trying to turn things around quickly. There can often be a lot of ambiguity there and unanswered questions that partners need help addressing. So that's where VIA Strategies, our in-house consulting practice, comes in. We provide the due diligence and transportation planning and analysis services to help answer some of those important questions, like where does microtransit make sense in our network? How exactly is it going to work with our fixed route services and our ADA paratransit services, if those exist there? What kind of ridership can we expect? What vehicles should we select for the service? How can we market the service to potential riders and get community buy-in for the service? So that's our main goal with this practice. We've done about 75 different consulting engagements, whether through public procurements and RFPs, or less formally through Olivia's team on the partnership side. And those can range from network redesign studies and what are called comprehensive operations analysis for the transit folks in the call. We also do pretty more straightforward microtransit feasibility studies, as well as studies that are more specialized and focused on paratransit or upgrading older dial-a-ride and demand response services. And then we also work with VIA's in-house simulation software to really ground truth how microtransit would actually function on a community's transportation network. And again, take some of the ambiguity out of the situation. So that being said, I'll dive into our Kennett Square microtransit study. So like Tim introduced at the outset, Kennett Square received a grant from TMACC to investigate microtransit in the township as well as the smaller borough of Kennett Square. And for those, I believe most of you are familiar with the area, but if you're not, Kennett Square, it's sort of outer rural suburb of Philadelphia area in Chester County. The borough itself is relatively low income. There's a large mushroom industry workforce that lives in the community, predominantly Latinx community. And unfortunately, just due to the land use patterns and the way the area has developed, there is limited coverage of fixed route transit in the area. So TMACC operates the Scoot service between Westchester and Oxford, passing through Kennett Square. There's also the countywide paratransit service through Rover. And then addressing some of those workforce transportation challenges, there's also an informal network of sort of van pool systems called Roderos, which are serving the mushroom industry workforce in Kennett Square. But I think where the study came from is, there's a clear need for better public transit access in this community, particularly expanding coverage to a wider range of destinations and over longer hours of operation than is currently feasible to offer on a fixed route service. And the community also just wanted to understand how microtransit in particular can best serve those point-to-point, more locally oriented trips, in a lower density community, and ultimately improve the quality of service relative to the other options that folks have available in Kennett Square. So the next couple of slides, what we had in mind, this, you can almost consider this as like a kind of a prototype. If you were to consider a feasibility study for microtransit in another community, in your community, these are some of the workflows that you might imagine, whether you're conducting these yourselves in-house or working with a consultant like us. So I'll go through some of those workflows, and we can answer any questions you might have at the end. So the first bit of work that we always like to address with our partners is just taking an essential pulse check of the transportation network. And the idea here is we need to see how the network is performing. We know at a high level that there's a need for better mobility in this area, but we need to quantify it. We need to evaluate where the need is stronger or weaker relative to the rest of the area. And the main way that we do that is by conducting a demographic and socioeconomic study using census data. We work with our partners and stakeholders to identify the key activity centers in an area that are likely to drive demand for public transit. So those would be things like major employers, hospitals, shopping centers, etc. And we with this analysis, we really try to paint a picture of within the larger community, where are the hotspots of demand that are not being effectively served by fixed route or by other options available. And of course, in every community, there's going to be unique challenges. One particular challenge that we've had in Kennett Square so far is just a lack of information on that informal network of van pools that I mentioned, the roderos. So we're working with some of our stakeholders to get better connected with the Hispanic community in Kennett Square, and trying to tease out exactly who's being served by those van pools, when they're available, how reliable they are, and helping to answer those kinds of questions. Again, some of the challenges with a study like this, the data sets that you can find from public agencies and the census are only going to tell you so much. It's very important in any kind of a transit study, but particularly a new mode like microtransit, to engage with the community and stakeholders, and really get an improved understanding of what transportation needs and preferences exist in that community. So for Kennett Square, what we're doing, we're carrying out public engagement activities on a couple of levels. We are distributing a public online survey that's basically just a survey of like, where are your typical places that you need to get to by public transit? What are the issues that you encounter when you use public transit? What service improvements, like longer hours of operation, nicer vehicles, etc. What service improvements might encourage you to use transit more? And then we introduce the idea of microtransit, saying, here's the general idea of a service that we had in mind. Is this something that would interest you? What are the barriers that you might face to using that? So we really try to get a sense of the needs and preferences of residents and workers through a survey like that. We're also working with major employers and stakeholders to, again, really drill down on the needs for better transit service in the area. And then we're also planning to conduct a couple of public meetings to present some initial microtransit service concepts in early 2022. And of course, the main challenge here is just ensuring that the slice of the public who you interact with through all these activities is indeed representative of the community itself. So in our case, that means making sure that all of our outreach materials are translated into Spanish. We have a Spanish speaker on the project team who's helping us. And again, working with local stakeholders who can help introduce you to some of the harder to reach communities. I think something that is really important to focus on when you're thinking about microtransit is what we call the use case, or another way to think of the use case is from a transit industry perspective is who are your types of customers or types of trips that microtransit is aiming to serve. What are the most likely types of trips? So in the case of a place like Kennett Square, the main use cases are just improving mobility in a rural area in places that are quite a ways off of any fixed route service. Another one would be improving connections to jobs and employers. For many of those mushroom farms, like I mentioned, there is not good fixed route service or any fixed route service that's feasible for workers to get to work that way. So that would be a major use case. Improving paratransit service is another one. In most paratransit services, you need to book at least 24 hours in advance. So there's an opportunity with microtransit to potentially offer same day or even on demand service that can be pre-booked as well. And then, of course, providing first and last mile connections to regional transit service like bus and train stations is another very common one. So once we've explored the needs of the community through a look at the transportation network, you've done a bit of public engagement, you've articulated your use cases for microtransit, then we start to draw up some of our service alternatives and scenarios. So here is where we would take a look at some of the best practices that we found, such as the York example that Olivia touched on, other examples that we've seen from our experience as an operator. We'll also look at other nearby examples from other operators to see, what are the best in class features and service designs for microtransit in this area. And we'll start to draw up exactly what microtransit service is going to look like in this area, looking at zone boundaries, how many residents and jobs are likely to be served, what are the hours of operation, what are the typical use cases that we can expect in this area. And this is just an example on the right-hand side where we kind of draw out some of those key findings for a potential zone. This is an example from Florida. And then something where VIA has really got a great deal of expertise in this area. It's one thing to draw up a series of maps and say we want microtransit here, here, and here, but it's quite another to say, we have simulation tools to accurately predict exactly how microtransit is going to function in each of those areas. And because of VIA's expertise as an operator and through developing our software algorithm, we've created these internal simulation tools that do exactly that can measure the quality of service on hundreds of different parameters. And the main trade-off, though, that we're testing with the simulation tool is the trade-off between the number of vehicles, which is related to the size of the zone, the potential ridership that you're likely to serve. You expand the zone, you can serve more riders. And then, of course, those two are in tension with the quality of service. So if the number of vehicles is kept constant, for instance, your ridership goes up, that would mean that your quality of service goes down. So, ideally, we try to balance the three legs of this tripod and come up with an optimal solution that serves sufficient ridership to be cost effective, has sufficient vehicles to accommodate demand but isn't oversupplied, and then also meets your quality of service goals as a transit provider. And then, of course, at the end of this consulting stage, we like to just tie up our work in a final report or final presentation, which includes, of course, the key findings from the existing conditions, public engagement, the development of service alternatives, and the simulations and service testing that we just discussed. When we're preparing the final report and presentation, this is where we often bring in those stakeholders that we engaged at the outset of the project to make sure that everybody's still engaged on the project, still excited about it, and that's often the transition where we can start to prepare for launch and implementation of the service, which is exciting. So as always, we are available to potential partners. If there is anything that we can discuss with you, we're happy to continue this conversation, whether that's introducing you to other partners where we have operations, conducting some of those service simulations, like we said. potentially, if it makes sense, even come up with some kind of a consulting proposal where we could dive into some of these aspects in more detail, or take a deeper dive at some of the technology components. Well, I think that was our piece from the VIA side. Tim, if you want to continue.
Great. Thank you so much. I appreciate that, David. Both of yours and Olivia's presentation, really sheds a light on a lot of things that we're doing here in Chester County. With that, I'd like to make the shift over to Derek Sherman from CATA to talk about his work that he's done putting this together in the Bellefonte area. Derek, it's all yours.
Well, pretty hard to follow up on both Olivia and David. They were pretty comprehensive, which I appreciated. And I will say this is that I've been looking at this stuff since 2018, and although we are not currently with VIA, VIA does exceptional job out there. I speak with Rabbit regularly, and they seem to be very pleased with everything down there. So they do a very good job and been around for a long time, and I'm impressed with everything they always have to offer. So with that, my name is Derek Sherman. I'm the Assistant ADA and On-Demand Operations Manager at CATA. In 2018, CATA started looking at microtransit as an option. We came up with three main goals. One was to provide better service. The area in which we operate currently in, back then had a route system that went through Bellefonte and Pleasant Gap, came back into State College. It took about an hour and 10 minutes. There's very little ability to operate within Bellefonte, which is a growing community. Is also our county seat. We were not servicing this area well whatsoever, and that's putting it nicely. So we started looking at different options. One, it was a very expensive route, which you'll see in our third goal was more cost-effective mode. The other problem that we were facing was that our ridership and our area and the buses we had were becoming a problem. We have Penn State right in the middle of our center region. We were struggling with capacity issues. So we were trying to figure out ways where we could reallocate those buses out of a lower, our lower density areas into our higher density areas and increase capacity to many of our routes that feed into Penn State. Penn State is most of our ridership. So back in 2020, we implemented, January of 2020, we implemented microtransit as a service into the Bellefonte area. As we all know, about 2 months later, COVID hit, and we started realizing all the benefits to microtransit very quickly. Our bus ridership dropped 97% within a week. And what the positive was, we watched our microtransit program increase exponentially throughout the pandemic, and actually became successful to a point where it actually started worrying us a little bit. When we implemented it, we were not actually prepared for what we were seeing, because we initially were running bus service side by side. We actually pulled bus service out of the area and just implemented microtransit. We expanded the program over to Pleasant Gap, which I'll show you a map here shortly. This is our current service area. It's about 16 square miles. As you can see, there's Bellefonte, Pleasant Gap. There we go. So what we've learned over this time is there's a lot of pros to microtransit. One, the flexibility, as both David and Olivia talked about. We did find that through COVID. We made, I think, 6 changes at least to the program through COVID. And that was implementing Saturday service, taking away Saturday service, adjusting to later service to cover bus routes. The other part that we found is the supplementing our ADA and paratransit. At the time, we contract our paratransit out to another company, and the trips out to Bellefonte were getting, they were a long trip to go out to Bellefonte coming to State College. Or they're going out to Bellefonte just to run a couple blocks. What we found was when we implemented microtransit into this area, those calls decreased for paratransit, but increased for microtransit, and allowed these people, as David talked about, allowed these people to actually utilize same-day service instead of having to, book their trip to the supermarket or book their trip to the drugstore 24 hours in advance, not knowing what the next day may, what things may happen. We've seen mobility within Bellefonte. Bellefonte's a growing community. It's our county seat, as I mentioned. And that's the one biggest surprise that we saw. The amount of movement within Bellefonte that occurred. And this has been great for not only Bellefonte, it's been great for our patrons. It's also been great for the businesses in the area. It's allowing people to move around. Our bus system did not do that. It's since then, as Penn State came back in, opened back up, our people working at Penn State, which we have quite a few out in Bellefonte, we have actually put a express route from Bellefonte to State College back in place. Now this is 2 hours in the morning, 2 hours in the afternoon. Microtransit feeds into that. And then in the afternoon, we've upped our availability to a connector outside of Bellefonte during the midday. The ease for these people to book their trips has been a huge pro. This is probably, for lack of better terms, Bellefonte's probably more a lower income area than the other parts of our center region. So they have the ability to book via the app. Those who can't, or do not have a smartphone, which, some do, they can go on the website. And then, we still have the ability to call in. And we also accept walk-ups, which we don't get a ton of, but we still have, some people that will see the van when it actually is not rolling, which is not often anymore. Our ridership has increased exponentially over the past year. But the flexibility has been probably the biggest thing that we've seen out of microtransit. As both David and Olivia talked about, there's a lot of abilities to move things, change things. And I will say, and I know other transit agencies around the country that I've talked to over COVID, that, microtransit really became probably a savior in a lot of aspects to many of them, because it was a somewhat easy to drop in and maneuver with all the issues that everyone was facing. Some of the cons we faced, one of the first things, which I think we've alleviated, but one of the first things when you're pulling out, if you're going to pull out bus service and you still want to have ADA service in there, how do you do that? We have actually, our board has approved us to be able to, anywhere we have microtransit zones, our ADA and paratransit service will operate within those zones. So instead of 3/4 mile, we have 3 different options for funding now, which took a little bit to figure out. But it is there's solutions to those issues, but they're things that we faced. But I think they're good problems. Funding, as of right now, at least in the state of Pennsylvania, we're waiting on approval for microtransit as a service for CATA through PennDOT. So right now, the funding for this is coming out of our bus operations budget. The other thing that we found is one of the things that were hard for the patrons to understand is scheduling for your arrival. So we have people that were trying to get to work on time, and this is a shared ride service. A trip that should take 7 minutes could turn into 15. So educating the public was huge, not only prior to implementation, but continual education as we keep going. And our drivers were a big part of that, and they continue to be, because as you see towards the bottom, towards the side there, our first month we did 542 passengers. Our wait times were very minimal. Now our wait times are about 10 minutes. We're doing about 155 rides a day. We do have peak times where we're running almost 26 trips in an hour. That changes how people have to book, and we have to be on top of making sure they understand that. So they may have to book 40 minutes ahead of time to get somewhere. That's also part of why we put our express routes in. But education, and I can't stress this enough, education with these programs prior to implementation and throughout is huge. It's made life easier for us. I continue to go out and do presentations to, we have one, for example, we have a senior home that I think we've been there 8 times now, and they've asked us to come back. And what's great is that, we're able to engage with that, those people in there. And, those who don't have apps but have smartphones, I've sat there and downloaded the app for them and taught them how to use it while we sit there. What that does for us is it alleviates some of the calls coming in, which takes some of the stress off of our dispatch. But we have seen a cost savings. We've watched our ridership increase in that area. The Bellefonte Borough is very happy with what they're seeing. They're not one of our member municipalities, but they're pleased with what they're seeing. They're growing out there. They continue to grow, and which helps us because we're a part of that. This also has given CATA another tool in our toolbox to utilize, because we've actually just back in August, we expanded into another area, which is Boalsburg. We continue to run bus service side by side with a microtransit pilot in there. But from August to September, we saw a 60% increase in ridership. September to October, we saw 75%. And right now we're on track of another 75% gain from the previous month. And we're doing the same things. The only difference is right now, where COVID kind of cut our ability to get out in the public, we're back out in the public again, speaking, with our stakeholders, and that's been huge. This has allowed CATA to provide a less expensive but more effective service to areas that we didn't have answers to prior. And we continue to look at different areas of our service to possibly implement this into as we keep going from pilot to pilot. CATA Go as a service for us has been, our board actually this past summer approved it to be one of our 3 services now. But we still continue to run pilot programs in Bellefonte and Boalsburg now. So as you can see there, down by the side, our ridership, October, we did a little over 3,700 riders. As of November 16th, our total riders since day one were surpassed 65,000. Our wait times in October were over 10 minutes. Our ride times were sitting about 13, and we do about 800 plus average rides per week right now in Bellefonte. The last 2 weeks, that's increased to mid nines. And we continue to see those things. Since then, we were operating this in-house back in the summer. The company that we contract out for our paratransit service has taken over our microtransit service now, and we operate that side by side. And the next thing we're looking at is how we can dual purpose these vehicles for both paratransit and microtransit, and seeing if we can get that to work. One of the obstacles we face right now is that it's two different operating systems. So there's always things you run into. There's always issues you run into, and it's just finding the right solution to fit the area, to fit your needs. So but if there's any questions, I know Rabbit specifically, I've spent time down there. I've been on the phone with David Juba down there often, and he's been great. And if there's ever any questions, anything, I'm more than happy to sit with anyone, talk with anyone, and help anyone out, because that's been afforded to me, so I've appreciated it. But that's it here, Tim.
Thank you, Derek. I really appreciate that, because you can talk about that real world experience that you have right now in the Bellefonte area, and I thought that was really important for us as we look at different models here. I know that we are at 9:03 here. We do have Brian Donovan with his brief presentation. If somebody does feel that they need to jump off, don't have to apologize. We try to manage close to the time here, but when we have great discussion like this, we just leave it to flow. And we will address, I have a dozen questions in the chat here that I have taken down that we'll look at here at the Q&A. So with that, Brian Donovan, it's all yours.
Okay, thank you, everybody. Let me just start up the screen share and get it into. Okay, thanks, everybody. I'm Brian Donovan. I'm transportation planner at Chester County Planning Commission. Going to be going through some items with you related to public transit in the county, talking about, with the great microtransit presentations that we just heard, important to sort of, as you see, a lot of them involve fixed route service or complement fixed route service, or, or modify it. So it's good to get that background here of what fixed route service means in the county, and how it can be improved, and what we're doing about that. So I wanted to start with some context here, some ongoing projects having to do with public transit planning. First is, we at Chester County are working with DVRPC to update the county's public transportation plan to bring it in line with Landscapes 3, our comprehensive plan. And going on with that in concert is two efforts by SEPTA. One most relevant probably to this discussion is Bus Revolution. Some of our other speakers referenced as well, which is a comprehensive look at SEPTA's bus network to look for improving efficiencies and ridership, and improving the service environment overall. SEPTA, in concert with that, is also reimagining, if you will, regional rail, and those services. One of the goals, I think, not speaking for SEPTA, but is to make sure that those sort of rail and bus really complement each other, and looking at the transit network system as a whole. So here's another effort that we have going on here in the county. We have long recognized that, out here in Chester County, there's often some pretty insufficient shelters and bus stop amenities. So a project that we have going on here is identifying some higher volume bus stops in the county that lack shelter amenities. So kind of looking around the county, seeing which ones are, high ridership relative to what we see in Chester County, and what kind of amenities do they have. So we found some locations in Coatesville, Phoenixville, and Westchester, and we're kind of going to be treating this a little bit as like a pilot project, and we're putting some funds together to provide shelters at some of these higher volume stops, and trying to find solutions for maintenance agreements, which is often can be a stumbling block for new shelters. Their shelters are generally not at all owned by SEPTA. They're, and particularly in the suburban area, they are often advertising companies like Clear Channel, who are kind of backing out of that environment seemingly more and more. So there's a gap here in providing quality shelters, and the county is looking to see what we can do to address that. Next, I want to touch on the Westchester Pike Coalition, which is a regular meeting of the 2 counties, Chester and Delaware counties, and the 10 municipalities and other interested stakeholders along Route 3 Westchester Pike. One of the founding projects of this coalition was an effort to implement a direct bus style service on the corridor. This map that you're seeing here comes from a DVRPC plan touching on this, and it's just conceptual. It's not to say that these would be the stops, but it's the idea of implementing a service that would have fewer stops, better amenities at each stop, as it would have higher ridership, and decreasing travel time across the corridor, altogether improving the experience of riders on the corridor, and particularly those riders who are going, perhaps the full length of the corridor or a very long ride there. So this also works in concert then with ongoing efforts with SEPTA and DVRPC. They have been studying corridors in the region, including Westchester Pike, to see that which ones could adopt this type of service. It's a type of service that SEPTA has adopted in Northeast Philly on the what they call a Boulevard Direct. And so they're looking at other corridors where there's potential for it to be implemented, and the results of all that study are going to be fed back into the bus revolution study, the comprehensive bus network redesign. So we look forward to those results and for improving transit service on the Westchester Pike corridor. So that's all I've got. Kick it back over to you, Tim, and we can address any questions at the end.
Great, thank you so much, Brian. So I do have a list of questions here, and majority of them are for David and Derek. So the first one that I'll throw out there to David and Derek is, how are the return trips booked?
So I want to make sure the return trips are going to be booked the same way as the what I call origin destination trips. The origin trip will be booked the same way as the destination trip. So I'm not sure how VIA is set up, but the platform we're with, once you cannot, if you're in the middle of your origin trip, you have to complete that trip before you can book your destination trip. So I'm hoping that answers the question. And like I said, I'm not David.
Right. The via works much the same way. The return trip would be booked in the same way that your inbound trip is booked.
So and I guess the follow-up piece to that is, are you booking both those trips at the same time, or can you book the return trip once you're done your task and you want to return back to your origin?
Oh, I see. So it would be two bookings. So you book the first leg, you arrive at the destination, complete your shopping, doing whatever you're doing there, and then book again for the return trip.
Okay, great, thank you. So one of the other questions was transit availability. So how do I know that there is going to be a vehicle available to pick me up?
I think that's a great question. It goes to, the heart of the service design that we work on as via strategies when we consult with our partners. Is a big part of that is making sure that there is sufficient number of vehicles for the service area to provide the quality of service that we're looking for, whether that's measured by the typical wait time, hours of operations, and what have you. So yeah, it's definitely something we look at closely, and we try to really carefully optimize the number of vehicles so that passenger quality of service is good throughout the day.
Great. Does the availability or lack thereof fixed route connections impact the use and success of a transit service? So do you have to have a fixed route for microtransit to work, or does microtransit work as a standalone, or do they complement each other and become really strong?
And I would say David wants to touch on this because they have a very vast region, but just from what we've seen, we've operated without fixed route. We've operated it with fixed route and our old fixed route system, and we're operating with a commuter level service. So it's worked in every scenario. I think what we're doing now is we're dialing it in to more efficiencies is what's happening now as we keep moving forward. So I think it can work in every scenario, but with that said, there's also, it really depends on your structure, what you're trying to do, what your goals are for that area. So there's a lot more involved in it than just that. So it can and it cannot. And I know that's kind of a back and forth answer, but it's a reality answer.
That's absolutely right, Derek. I just wanted to jump in. I think it really is context dependent. We have models, partnerships at VIA where it covers all three of those examples that you mentioned. Areas where microtransit is operating standalone with no fixed route service. We have places where we ourselves are operating fixed route service instead of microtransit. We have places where we operate both simultaneously. So it really depends on the service area and the network that we're looking at. So that involves looking at the density of development, which feeds into the ridership. It looks at the types of trips that folks are likely to make. Are these locally oriented, shopping trips to the neighborhood pharmacy, shorter trips, or are folks connecting to a regional transit system like SEPTA? Those are definitely key questions. Again, it depends on the context. In general, if you're looking at a use case where you need to move large numbers of people across very long distances, for instance, between Kennett Square and Westchester, Kennett Square to Philadelphia, those are use cases that are probably best served by fixed route in most cases. However, if you're looking at the last mile, shorter trips, more locally oriented within the Kennett Square area, for something like that, where you have a lower intensity of demand, microtransit is probably more suitable there. So it really requires a look at your service area and your transportation network.
So another question, goes to the economics of this is the cost per rider. And I know, when we look at the subsidy that we pay per rider too for some of the transit side. Derek and David, can you address that and what you see on that front? Is it a lower number? Is it a higher number? Is it a more consistent number?
I can go first. Again, this is context dependent. It really depends first and foremost on the type of procurement model that you have in place. So Olivia touched on software as a service versus transportation as a service. I think that choice in which type of procurement model you go for, it has a significant bearing on cost per trip, just because whether you're using transit agency drivers and fleet, that might pose a different cost versus using a subcontractor or independent contractor drivers in the task model. And then another driver of cost would just be the level of demand that you're experiencing in the area. So a high ridership service that's performing really well, obviously, is going to make that cost per trip a bit lower if you can satisfy the demand with the same initial fleet.
Yeah, David's right on there. And one thing I would say is, when looking at this, be very cautious that that's not the only thing you're looking at. Because I will tell you, our cost per rider went up some, but our overall cost of service to the area went down. And so you got to be very careful on the numbers, because if you start getting keyed in on just certain things, you're not looking at the big picture. And also it plays into your goals too. But it is, if we simply looked at that number alone, we may probably waver on what we want to do. But so I think you need to have a larger picture when you're really evaluating this stuff. Obviously, it needs to play into it, but you do have to be careful and have a larger picture on the what your overall goals are.
I have to agree with you, Derek. Cost per passenger trip is important, and it's certainly important when you're applying for grant funding and modeling out your budgets and everything. But there are other KPIs that you should be looking at as well. Looking at the geographic coverage, looking at the percentage of the community that's being served with a broader coverage area for microtransit. Looking at the quality of service, like the wait times, walking distance to the pickup location. Those are very important as well. So, if you just looked at cost per trip, you might find that, fixed route is less expensive in a lot of areas, not universally, but many cases. The problem, of course, is not everyone can use fixed route because the walking distances are too long, service is too infrequent. So there's definitely trade-offs there that you have to look at.
Then the last question I have here is, Derek, how do you report this out to PennDOT? Where does that go for that ridership data? Is it a shared ride? Is it?
That's actually a good one. Right now, PennDOT we just put it in with our bus figures. That's what I mentioned earlier, that we're awaiting approval. Once that happens, it does go into shared ride from what we're understanding, but we're waiting on direction from PennDOT on that. Now, Rabbit, may have a better answer on that because they've been doing this longer and they may be ahead of us on that, which they probably are.
Those, I don't know if anybody wants to, and I can't see everybody. John, if you help me, if anybody wants to raise their hand or put a piece into the chat here. I know that, you know, we are pushing 9:21 here at the end of the program. Want to make sure that we got all the questions that were out. Not seeing any additional chatter in the chat here. We'll kind of round things out. So thank you to all of our speakers. I know that Olivia is not able to be with us now, but David and Derek, great job in bringing microtransit alive for us, especially kind of looking at what we can do here in Chester County. Brian, thank you for your input. I know it's a lot of hard work with some of the stuff that the county is doing with the transit planning, especially with the Westchester Pike corridor. But, you know, that really shows us is, again, that was the old trolley, how microtransit could feed into that, servicing that line and making that line more robust for SEPTA here. So thank you very much for all of your presentations. For everyone, you know, we are in the middle of our annual Veterans Gift Drive. We will have that open until December 8th. We will be delivering the packages on December 10th. If you would like to support the Veterans Gift Drive, we'd really appreciate that. We're looking for household goods. So when the veterans are making their transition from homelessness or from the hospital into their apartment, we're trying to provide them the well-beings that they need for going into that house. We are doing that because we know a lot of the folks that are going to the VA are using our Link bus service. So that is the reason why we support the Veterans Gift Drive the way we do. If you have not, please check out our website. We do have a Monday morning memo. We are hoping to have this presentation up for Monday morning memo. If you have not signed up, go to the website and sign up for your Monday morning memo. We are also on social media with Facebook, Twitter, and LinkedIn. Again, these will be places that we'll post it, but, you know, friend us, however you want to do that, access us through social media, that would be great. And if you're somebody else that you think should belong to TMACC or be a part of this conversation, I encourage you to reach out to friends and colleagues and join into this conversation. So with that, everybody be well, be safe, and have a great holiday weekend. Thank you, everyone.